The White House revealing President Trump has been diagnosed with a condition called chronic venous insufficiency. The news comes after the president and some observers noticed swelling of his ankles and some bruising on his right hand. He appeared to try to cover up with makeup. I want to bring in CNN Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta. So, Sanjay, what is this condition?
So chronic venous insufficiency, a relatively common condition, something that gets more common as you get older, involves a problem with the veins. That's the venous part of that. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins take blood back to the heart. If the veins aren't working properly, if they're not doing their job, blood can sort of start to pool. And that was probably causing that swelling that you just showed in that picture there. Again, a fairly common condition. I will say a couple of interesting things. He had a physical exam back in April, and so 3 months ago or so, and they made no mention of it at that time. So either it wasn't there or they didn't talk about it. It does appear that this problem has either started or worsened over the last 3 months.
Good to have you. Welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. Something is terribly wrong with Donald Trump, and the evidence is no longer subtle or ambiguous or open to alternative interpretation. What the American people witnessed across multiple public appearances in Florida is not normal political behavior. It is not strategic messaging delivered poorly. It is not exhaustion from a grueling campaign schedule. What unfolded on stage after stage, speech after speech, moment after moment, is what medical professionals describe when they talk about severe cognitive deterioration happening in real time, visible to anyone who is willing to look with clear eyes and resist the gravitational pull of partisan denial.
Now, as we've been reporting, President Trump has been diagnosed with a minor vein condition. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt announced today that the president has chronic venous insufficiency, which has caused swelling in his lower legs. And she also addressed bruising that's been seen on the president's hand, saying it was a minor soft tissue irritation from frequent handshaking. CBS News Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. LaPook, Dr. John LaPook joins us now on all of this. Very good to see you, as always, Dr. LaPook. For those who aren't as familiar with this, can you explain what chronic venous insufficiency is?
It's kind of interesting when you think about it, right? The heart contracts, it pumps blood to the brain and the rest of the body through arteries. But how does the blood return against gravity to the heart? From the ankles, for example. So the muscles in your leg, when they contract, they squeeze the blood upstream against gravity through veins. And what stops it from falling right back down again is a series of one-way valves that are in your legs.
And the most devastating confirmation did not come from Trump's political enemies or from the media organizations he constantly attacks. It came from Dr. Phil, the television personality Trump personally invited on stage during a bizarre event at a high school in the Villages, surrounded by an audience of senior citizens.
We're also joined by very much of a legend. He's really an amazing, he straightens you out mentally, probably has his own problems, but we don't have to know about that. But we've all grown up watching him. I've watched him for so many years. I did a show before the election. Come here, Dr. Phil. Come on up here, Dr. Phil. Get up here. Give them a little lecture, but very short. Give them a little lecture on life. Talk about life for 2 minutes or less.
Well, hello. I had a different reaction than the president when I told my wife I was coming to the Villages. She said, oh, no.
Even Dr. Phil, a man who has built his career on validating people's feelings and avoiding confrontation with powerful guests, could not help but signal that something is deeply amiss. The moment was extraordinary in its awkwardness. Trump was doing what he now does at virtually every public appearance, boasting about cognitive exams as though they were evidence of genius rather than indicators of something far more troubling. He talks about these tests constantly now, compulsively, returning to them the way people return to memories they are trying to convince themselves are real.
By the way, Mr. President, I've given that cognitive test that he took. I used to administer those, where you give them 9,000 divided by 2, 6, 7. I recall one guy did that about the president's age. Took about 6 minutes to go through it. I said, so what's your answer? And he said, a small wire-haired terrier. So great that he got that done. No kidding. Listen, I really do want to take a chance to talk about this a little bit, because what the president is doing here is really something you got to think about differently.
And Dr. Phil, who claims to have administered some of these very exams, gently but unmistakably tried to educate both Trump and the audience about what these tests actually mean. The people who take these cognitive assessments, he explained, are not the people Trump seems to think they are. The subtext was impossible to miss, even for those in the audience who desperately wanted to miss it. Healthy people do not take cognitive exams with the frequency Trump describes. Healthy people do not brag about passing tests designed to detect dementia. Healthy people do not make those tests a central feature of their public identity. The fact that Trump believes passing a dementia screening is something to boast about, something that demonstrates his superior mental fitness, is itself one of the most revealing symptoms of his condition. The speech at the Villages was a cascade of disjointed fragments and inexplicable detours that left even his supporters exchanging uncertain glances. He spent significant portions of his time on stage attacking the people who set up the sound system at the high school, veering off into extended complaints about audio equipment, while the audience of elderly Floridians sat in bewildered silence waiting for him to return to something resembling a coherent point. He made strange noises, vocalizations that were not words, sounds that seemed to emerge from somewhere other than conscious intention. He did the thing he does increasingly often now, producing a guttural noise that is not quite a word and not quite a cough, something that hovers in the uncanny valley between speech and something far less intentional. It is strange to witness. It is stranger still to witness repeatedly, across multiple events, as though some circuit in his brain is shorting out and producing the same glitch over and over. Then there were the cognitive exam riffs, the extended monologues where Trump attempts to demonstrate his mental acuity by reciting fragments of math problems that make no sense when strung together. Take 99, multiply by 9, divide by 3, add 4,293, divide by 2, subtract by 93, divide by 9. He presents this as evidence of his cognitive superiority, as though the ability to recite numbers in sequence constitutes proof of presidential fitness. But listening to these monologues, watching him string together arithmetic operations that do not cohere into any actual problem, seeing him present this verbal chaos as a demonstration of mental sharpness, the impression is not of a man showing off his intellect. The impression is of a man who has lost the ability to distinguish between thinking and the performance of thinking, between actual cognitive function and the hollow mimicry of words that sound like cognition but signify nothing. Dr. Gupta, the head of Midas Health, has been explicit about what these tests actually are. These are dementia exams. These are clinical instruments designed to screen for serious cognitive decline, for the kind of neurological deterioration that affects memory and recall and basic executive function. No neurologist recommends taking these tests with the frequency Trump claims to take them. No healthy person takes the Montreal Cognitive Assessment every few months. The test itself is not a difficult exam that intelligent people breeze through. It asks whether you can remember words, whether you can draw a clock, whether you can identify animals. These are not challenges for high-functioning adults. They are screenings for impairment. The fact that Trump treats passing this test as a flex, as evidence that he is operating at peak cognitive capacity, reveals a profound confusion about what the test measures and why it exists. He thinks he is proving his genius. He is actually signaling that someone has deemed it necessary to repeatedly screen him for dementia. But the medical commentary, as damning as it is only one piece of the larger picture that is now breaking into the national conversation with increasing urgency. Governor Pritzker of Illinois has spoken publicly about what the country is witnessing, framing it not as a political attack, but as a genuine concern about fitness for office. Trump's own former White House attorney, Ty Cobb, someone who worked directly with him and saw his mental functioning up close, has added his voice to the chorus of people warning that something is seriously wrong. This is not a partisan narrative being driven by Democrats who oppose Trump's policies. This is a growing consensus that spans political boundaries because the evidence is so overwhelming and so publicly visible that it cannot be ignored or dismissed as media bias. The speeches Trump delivered in Florida on that single day provide a devastating catalog of cognitive disintegration. At the Palm Beach Forum Club, an event that was supposed to be a nonpartisan discussion, Trump launched into a fabricated narrative about the Civil War that was so historically incoherent it was difficult to even follow what he was trying to say. He attributed to General Robert E. Lee a quote that Lee never said, something about never fighting uphill, and the phrasing was so garbled, "Never fight uphill, me boys," that it was not even recognizable as a real expression that anyone has ever used. Then he compounded the absurdity by praising Lee as an incredible general whose brilliance was demonstrated by the fact that the Civil War lasted 4 years. The logic inverted on itself in real time. A shorter war would have indicated superior generalship. Dragging out a losing conflict is not a mark of military genius. But Trump was not making an argument. He was stringing together fragments, associations that made sense in whatever internal landscape he was navigating, but collapsed into nonsense the moment they hit the open air. Then came the Strait of Hormuz, and this moment requires particular attention because it illustrates something beyond mere confusion or historical ignorance. Trump began describing the strategic waterway, and his description took on a quality that was unmistakably sexualized. The curves, he said, with an emphasis and a tone that made the audience audibly uncomfortable. Look at the curves. The language was the language of someone describing a body, not a geographical feature. This is what clinicians call disinhibition, the loss of the filtering mechanisms that normally prevent people from expressing inappropriate thoughts in inappropriate settings. The brain's editing function degrades, and what comes out is whatever passes through the neural pathways without the usual censorship. When a public figure begins describing international shipping lanes using the vocabulary and intonation of sexual appraisal, something in their neurological function has fundamentally shifted. The disinhibition manifested again in his extended commentary about Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. Trump talked about how beautiful she is, how attracted he is to her, and then he began doing a voice, an imagined version of Sheinbaum speaking to him. "Hello, Donald. How are you, Donald? You good? You good, Donald?" This went on for an uncomfortably long time while the audience watched a sitting president perform an imaginary flirtatious conversation with a foreign leader, apparently unaware or unconcerned about how this looked or sounded. This is not normal behavior. This is not a communication strategy or a political tactic. This is someone whose neurological function has degraded to the point where the boundaries between internal fantasy and external speech, between appropriate public conduct and private impulse, have become permeable in ways that are deeply alarming to anyone with clinical training. The strange noises continued, the guttural sounds that are not words, the vocalizations that seem to bypass the language centers entirely and emerge from some more primitive part of the brain. "Mom, I can't do it," he said at one point, a fragment of speech disconnected from any apparent context, as though a sentence intended for some other time and place had broken free and found its way into the middle of a political speech. The overall impression was of a mind that is no longer fully integrated, a consciousness that is firing in multiple directions simultaneously without any central organizing principle to bring coherence to the output. At the Forum Club, someone tried to steer the conversation toward less overtly political territory by asking why Trump chooses to live in Palm Beach. It was a gentle question, an attempt to normalize the interaction and give the president an easy topic he could handle without strain. Trump's response was to bring up Elton John. "Elton John once told me that when you give a great performance, you just end the show." There was no connection between the question and the answer. There was no logical bridge, no associative thread that a listener could follow to understand how the mind had moved from point A to point B. There was simply one thing and then another thing, adjacent in time but not in meaning. The output of a brain that can no longer reliably track the relationship between a question and its answer. Governor Pritzker's observation about the laughter is important here. The crowds at these events sometimes laugh, not because Trump is being intentionally funny, but because the behavior is so strange and unexpected that laughter becomes a default response. But this is not comedy. This is not a performance designed to amuse. This is someone who is psychologically and neurologically ill, deteriorating in full public view, and the people laughing are treating genuine pathology as entertainment. It is not funny, it is tragic, and it is dangerous, because the person experiencing this deterioration has access to nuclear weapons weapons and commands the most powerful military in human history. Trump's obsession with the cognitive exam has become a compulsive tic, a verbal ritual he returns to again and again, as though repeating the claim of having passed the test will somehow prove what the test itself was designed to question. He lies about insulin prices, claiming that Joe Biden tried to take credit for reductions that Trump himself implemented, an easily debunked falsehood that he nevertheless repeats with the conviction of someone who has lost the ability to distinguish between what happened and what he wishes had happened. He says it makes him see, a phrase that makes no grammatical or semantic sense, but that he delivers as though it carries profound meaning. I see. It makes me see. What are you talking about? An observer is forced to ask. And the question hangs in the air unanswered because there is no answer. There is only more fragments, more tangents, more verbal chaos spilling out in a continuous stream. The fabricated conversations with Iran may be the most alarming manifestation of all because they involve matters of war and peace and nuclear confrontation. Trump claims that the Iranians keep calling him, that they desperately want to make a deal, that he is so busy fielding their calls that he can barely keep up with his other responsibilities. Earlier in the day, on the White House lawn, he had told a similar story about Iranian officials reaching out, wanting to negotiate, and him being unsatisfied with their proposals. At the Forum Club, he returned to this theme, telling the audience that someone approached him about a golf tournament, and he responded by talking about how busy he is with the Iranians calling and trying to make a deal. The narrative is transparently fabricated. Iran is not calling. The diplomatic channels are not active. The conversations he is describing are not happening. He is making up interactions with a foreign adversary, creating fictional diplomatic scenarios in his mind, and then presenting them to the public as though they were real events he is actively managing. This is extraordinarily dangerous behavior for anyone, let alone a president. When a leader loses the ability to distinguish between internal fantasy and external reality, when he begins inventing conversations with foreign powers and making policy pronouncements based on those inventions, the potential consequences are catastrophic. A fabricated Iranian peace overture that exists only in Trump's mind could become the basis for a fabricated Iranian rejection that exists only in Trump's mind, which could become the justification for a military response based entirely on cognitive dysfunction rather than on anything actually happening in the real world. The stakes could not be higher. The person with the nuclear codes is having conversations with people who are not there. Dr. Gupta's explanation of the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the MoCA, is essential context for understanding what Trump is actually revealing every time he brings up these tests. The assessment screens for mild cognitive dysfunction. It focuses on recall and memory loss and basic cognitive functions. It is not a difficult test. It is not something that high-functioning adults celebrate passing. Saying you passed the MoCA is like saying you successfully identified which object is the ball and which is the cup. These are tasks designed to detect impairment in people who may be experiencing dementia. No neurologist recommends taking the test with the frequency Trump claims. No healthy person takes dementia screenings every 3 to 6 months. The only reason to repeatedly administer this test is if there is clinical concern about ongoing cognitive decline that needs to be monitored. Trump has inadvertently revealed that someone in his orbit, presumably his medical team, has deemed it necessary to screen him for dementia on a recurring basis. And rather than understanding what this implies, he has turned it into a brag. The physical manifestations are equally concerning. The strange noises, the slurring, the way his body sometimes seems to freeze or lock up, the difficulties with balance and coordination that have been captured on video at various events. The overall impression is of a system under tremendous strain, a body and brain that are deteriorating simultaneously and at an accelerating rate. Trump's father, Fred Trump, suffered from Alzheimer's disease, and the symptoms that Donald Trump is now displaying publicly are consistent with what medical professionals would expect to see in someone following a similar trajectory at a similar age. This is not a diagnosis from afar. It is an observation of publicly visible behavior that aligns with well-understood patterns of cognitive deterioration. The family history, the age, the frequency of cognitive screenings, the disinhibition, the confabulation, the difficulty maintaining coherent narrative threads, the invention of events that never occurred, all of it fits a pattern that is heartbreakingly familiar to anyone who has watched a loved one decline. The fact that this is happening in public, that the evidence is available for anyone who wants to see it, makes the political conversation around it all the more urgent. At what point does cognitive decline become a national security crisis? At what point does the inability to distinguish real diplomatic conversations from imaginary ones become grounds for invoking the 25th Amendment? How much public deterioration must occur before the people around the president, the cabinet officials and military leaders and congressional leaders who have the power to act acknowledge that the emperor is not merely unclothed but actively disintegrating? The country is watching someone unravel in real time, and the collective response has been a mixture of awkward laughter and willful denial, and increasingly desperate concern from those who understand what they are seeing. The test Trump keeps bragging about passing is designed to catch exactly what he is displaying. The irony is so dark it barely registers as irony at all.